So over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thanks for the invitation. I will attempt to provide some thoughts about that latter question, but I've got no more expertise really than anyone else in the room, I don't think.
Good to get your thoughts.
You bet. You don't worry, you'll get them. Count on me. Yes, as Tim says, I'm basically a plant scientist, and I feel some trepidation at participating in a more sociological forum such as this. But I'll call it how I see it, sitting where I'm sitting as a scientist doing research in plant genetics for the last 30-odd years, making GM plants for 34 years, and so on. So I'm in the time-honoured, maybe these lights could come down a little bit, is that possible? I don't know if that would make that a little clearer. The time-honoured manner, I will start off by telling you what I'm going to tell you. So I'm going to tell you that although you may have heard a lot of anxiety-provoking things said about the plants involving the letter G and M, it's a perfectly reasonable method to use for a more sustainable agriculture. And there are problems with the way it's currently regulated in Europe, particularly in Europe. I'll also comment on gene editing, which you may have heard a bit about, and I'll try and give a sort of an executive summary of what that means and what difference it might make. And this will be my general conclusion. Despite the many, many bad consequences of Brexit, in my view, enabling the UK to set its own rules for regulating crop genetic improvement is potentially in the public interest. So, in order to make that case, I've got to say something about the GM method itself and plant genetics in general. So, just to remind you that crops used to look like these kind of things here. Where's my arrow gone? Here we go. This is what maize used to look like. This is what bananas used to look like, full of seeds, and so on and so forth. So domestication has been crucial for rendering plants this great source of food that they are. And this is what carrots used to look like down here. Here's the maize again. This is what maize currently looks like, more or less, and this is what it used to look like. This is what undomesticated tomatoes look like. This is what bred tomatoes look like. So the point is that most crops are barely recognizable in their ancestors. They are already genetically modified, and in fact, let's examine that term, G and M. Modified from what? So this idea of something being modified is predicated on the assumption that there was something that was previously unmodified before we modified it. And actually that's a complete fiction. Darwin's idea was, he hadn't discovered genetics, even though he was a contemporary of Mendel. They never met or exchanged ideas. Darwin, we're asked to express his big idea succinctly, said descent with modification. So descent is the best you could say in the 19th century before genetics is discovered for genetics. So genetics, heritable modification, is the basis for natural selection and evolution. So plant breeders have always been using classical genetics to modify crops. They're all genetically modified, and this is why, actually, for practicing scientists, this whole idea that genetic modification might be bad, it's a distortion of the language. You don't even know how to get to grips with it because everything is genetically modified. And of course, there's all sorts of unnatural things we do, such as taking maize, tomato, potato, sunflower, etc., from South America to Europe, where they were never grown before. Isn't that actually a lot more unnatural than putting a gene in or not? So I use the term gene, so I need to, many of you may not be practicing geneticists, so let me summarize what you need to know about genes. Plants carry 30,000 or so genes, kind of same roughly numbers as us. Many of them contain a lot more, in fact. What does a gene do? It encodes the amino acid sequence of a protein. What is a protein? A protein is a little machine for doing a job. So they can do a chemical job, enzymes converting one molecule to another, or a physical job, e.g. muscle proteins, structural proteins like cartilage and keratin. So proteins are machines that do a job, and you can get genetic variation, you can get mutations in genes, or you get different forms of genes called alleles that specify slightly different proteins. And this variation that's in populations, in human populations and in plant populations, basically every generation generates new diversity. And in crop plants or in dogs, you look at dogs, for example, they're all descended from wolves. Look at the diversity in dogs. In the same way, plant breeders have selected from pre-existing variation to come up with specific desired properties in the resulting animal or plant. So the other thing to say about GM as it's sort of more conventionally used is it's not a thing, it's just a method. Okay, so a typical plant's got a bunch of chromosomes. So these are cartoon-like represented here. This is the centromere that conditions cell chromosome separation as cell division. And most of the genetic modification that's done takes advantage of a bacterium called Agrobacterium, which makes this kind of disease on plants. You sometimes see bigger versions of this on trees, galls. And this crown gall bacterium has a capacity to deliver DNA into plant cells, and the resulting plant DNA, the resulting plant cell with this added bacterial DNA has properties that render it conducive for bacterial growth. So it makes compounds that only the bacterium can use, called opines, and it also has regulated growth. So because it changes the hormone status. So this is something Agrobacterium does naturally, and what's been done is to take advantage of that to put in genes of interest into a plant chromosome, leaving behind the genes that mess up the plant from the Agrobacterium, and put it in using genes that enable you to select the plant cells that have received the DNA you want and put in DNA that confers a useful property. And it turns out, recently discovered a year or so ago, that sweet potato actually carries within it the residues of effectively a GM event, an Agrobacterium infection from thousands of years ago that put in some Agrobacterium tDNA. And some people have rather mischievously suggested that in order to allow organic farmers to grow sweet corn, what we need to do is use gene editing to remove that DNA. But anyway, I was going to say I'm being mischievous here. So anyway, so we've been eating, anybody who's eaten sweet potato is eating a GM sweet potato. The other thing to say about the GM method is people, it's sort of encapsulated in this misspeaking about genetic modification. The idea is that there's an unmodified thing to start with, and the fact is there's huge genetic variation within plant genotypes within any species. So what I've done here is to cartoon-like draw one of the chromosomes, let's say from a maize inbred. Maize has 10 chromosomes, let's just think about one of them. If you compare that same chromosome in different inbred lines from maize, you'll find that in one of them there's a bunch of DNA that's just missing. In fact, on average, 80%, only 80% of the DNA in any two maize inbreds is the same. There's 20% varying. So a huge proportion of the 3 billion base genome is characterized by presence and absence variation. If you've got a reference genome up here, it's also missing some of the DNA that's in some of these guys. So compared to that, the genetic variation introduced by the GM method is tiny in comparison to the variation that's already there. It used to be the case that GM wasn't quite as controversial as it is today. So you could buy this in Sainsbury's, made with genetically modified tomatoes. It was from a tomato that ripened more slowly, and so you had less wastage and higher solids when you turned it into puree. That was in the 90s. You could buy it, and then I think it was Iceland declaring it would be GM-free, not the country, the supermarket, that put all the other supermarkets on the back foot. I come back to saying GM is a method, not a thing. So you've got a plant with a bunch of genes in it, and then you add something, and it's still a plant, but it's got an extra gene. So in the same way as if you add an app to your iPhone, other cellular phones are available. I'm not endorsing anything. You've got an added function, but it's still an iPhone. If you add a gene to a potato with 60,000 genes, it's still a potato, but it's got some added functionality. And the balance of scientific evidence and deliberation by Royal Society, US National Academy of Sciences, et cetera, is that the method is safe and on balance benign. So although when I started doing this 34 years ago, you did wonder where it might lead, if there might be some, well, Donald Rumsfeld hadn't been invented then, but unknown unknowns. Now there aren't. So the real question is what, and I think this is what's so irritating again for as a protagonist in this, is the real question is what kind of agriculture do we want, and what should we use it for, not is there anything wrong with the method. Okay, so we need yield. Yield is good, I guess, is the argument I want to make. If you have more yield, you don't need as much land for the same amount of food. And don't underestimate how hard it is to produce good yields. I talk quite a lot to farmers, and that's what they tell me. And agriculture is per se unnatural. Okay, so that's a slightly antagonistic statement for some, perhaps. But we just want to, if you're concerned about the environment, then actually what you need is less agriculture. The more agriculture you have, the less space, the less environment you have for wildlife. Whatever the kind of agriculture, but low-yielding agriculture in the round, I would argue, is more damaging than high-yielding agriculture because it needs more land. So I've been part of various deliberations on these subjects. I was part of this one. I wasn't part of this one. This is John Beddington's report on the future of food and farming. Although it was originally came up with by Jules Priddy, the phrase sustainable intensification, I think, was popularized in this one. But I think that this is the spirit of both of those two reports, but I haven't seen it put this way, so I quite like this way of doing it. So you may remember back when people worried about energy security, pre-Trump and climate change, everyone would agree that there's no way that you could solve all these problems at once with one magic bullet. So if you're worried about energy security and climate change, you need multiple wedges, is the language. So you need not only nuclear, carbon capture and storage, and solar and wind, and you need better efficiency and conservation and more efficiency in transport. It's not one or the other. You actually need all of them. And I would argue that for food security, you need reduced meat consumption, reduced food waste, better agronomy, and better genetics. And you can use editing and the old-fashioned GM method and plant breeding and enhanced plant breeding with all the new molecular tools. We need all of them. Let's avoid false antitheses. So what has GM actually been used for? So it's not a great source of pride or pleasure to me. The main, one of the major uses has been this herbicide tolerance, usually resistance to glyphosate, and this makes it, so long as you haven't overused it or selected for glyphosate-resistant weeds, this is a helpful way of controlling weeds, because glyphosate, whatever you may have read about it, is a much less toxic herbicide than essentially most of the herbicides it replaced. So, and you've got to control weeds. You can lose 50% of your yield to weeds if you don't control weeds. The other really great trait that is a major deployment of the method is insect resistance, where what you do is you express a bacterial protein, in fact the same crystal protein in Bacillus thuringiensis that organic farmers apply to crops to control some insects, but you make that protein in the plant. And it's been widely adopted, 18 million farmers worldwide, 190 million hectares or so last year. But there's a lot more that we could use it for, and I'm a big advocate of using it for plant disease control by moving genes from one plant to another. But this just illustrates the BT. So I was in Bangladesh in November, in fact. Well, I didn't get to see any of these fields. But this BT brinjal or eggplant or aubergine, depending on where you come from, is very susceptible in Bangladesh and India to this insect. And farmers, to try and control it, go up and down fields with insecticides in their backpacks and spray. They poison themselves, they poison the environment. If you express this BT protein in the plant, then you don't have that problem. So this is good for their health, and good for their yields, and good for their margins. Like I say, I work on plant diseases, not just on crop diseases actually. Particularly I work on potato late blight. There's a lot of other very important diseases, notably the wheat rusts are a huge problem. We'd like to be able to intervene genetically rather than chemically to control disease because although these are very out-of-date figures, it's actually hard to get up-to-date figures. These days it's more like 20 billion a year of fungicides applied to control disease in crops worldwide. So, I argue that genetic control is better than chemical control because there's less risk of chemical collateral damage, less risk of poisoning farm workers, less fuel consumption, less CO2 emissions, less soil compaction from tractors going up and down, less work per unit of food. So here's one example. Oh, actually, I'm just showing you here. So this is what happens to a field of potatoes if you don't control late blight. You can lose the whole crop within a week to 10 days. So in Hawaii, if you ever go to Hawaii, if you eat papaya, or indeed many other parts of the US, the papaya has been engineered to resist papaya ring spot virus. And this engineering, which was done by the public sector, Cornell University and University of Hawaii, essentially it saved the Hawaiian papaya industry, and it continues to save the Hawaiian papaya industry. Where I work, Sainsbury Lab, I was part of this work. We've identified a gene from a wild mustard that's called EFR. Basically, it's an antenna. It helps a plant to know when a pathogen has showed up and can cause disease. And this helps, if you move it from the mustard to tomato, it helps the tomato detect bacterial wilt disease caused by Ralstonia. And you can see the difference here. If you've got this gene from a wild mustard in tomato, then you're resistant to bacterial wilt. Here's another example of the same kind of thing, not from my work. My colleague in the US, Brian Staskovitz. So there's a gene in pepper called BS2, confers resistance to a disease called bacterial spot. So if you've got the BS2 gene and you're a pepper, it's been bred in from Capsicum chacoense, then you're resistant, and if you don't have it in, you're toast, okay, if you infect with this bacterial disease. In tomato, this is what tomatoes usually look like after exposure to this disease, and there's not much variation in tomato for resistance to this disease. So what Brian did was to take the pepper gene and put it into tomato, and lo and behold, you've now got a disease-resistant tomato. And we're already eating the BS2 gene, at least you are in the US, because this pepper BS2 gene has been bred into essentially all the cultivated pepper varieties, at least for Florida. And if you can resist this disease, you can double the yield in tomatoes in field trials in Florida. So this is being taken forward by a charitable foundation aligned with the Sainsbury Lab, funded by David Sainsbury. And it's called the Two Blades Foundation. It might seem like a strange name. Edward Scissorhands, question mark. No. There's a quote from Jonathan Swift. Whoever makes 2 ears of corn or 2 blades of grass to grow where only one grew before deserves better of mankind and does more essential service than the whole race of politicians. I used this once actually giving a talk with Owen Paterson in the audience when he was Secretary of State. He was a bit bemused by this. Anyway, that was fun. couldn't cope with the idea that scientists might be worth more than politicians, I think. So this is from our work. We clone genes from wild relatives of potato, and this one actually could have been bred in to cultivated potato if you're prepared to wait 20 or 30 years. And this gene from RPI-VNT1, when GM delivered into potato, gives you resistance to potato late blight in a field trial. I often introduce this by saying, here's something you don't see every day, a GM field trial in Europe. And this is, well, from 2012. So we have a project now in combination with the Simplot company in the US. We've cloned 2 more of these, and we're going to stack them up so that it's going to be much more difficult for the pathogen to evolve to circumvent 3 different resistance genes at once than just to overcome one. It's like antibiotics. If you rely on, or indeed herbicide and herbicide tolerance, if you rely on one mode of action, then you're making it relatively easy for biology to invent around the obstacle you're putting in front of it. We're combining this with some other traits. So this is work of a colleague with the trial in Uganda, Mark Ghislaine from the CJR Institute SIP, Potato Improvement. And what you can see here is in the field in Uganda, blight-resistant potatoes, and what you would have been able to see here if you'd taken the photograph perhaps a week or 2 earlier is blight-sensitive potatoes that have been wiped out. So, you know, we're certainly the people I work with, where I and a number of colleagues are pushing for, is the direction of travel has to be that we want to identify genes for resistance to disease in one plant, often wild plants that are undomesticated, recruit them, bring them into crop plants in combinations, in stacks, and that way I think will greatly reduce the vulnerability of the genes we deploy to pathogen evolution. And these are rather technical things about why it's better to do it this way than with breeding. Yeah, I don't want to get hung up on the detail here. So, you know, I've told you that we've got this great method here. And with all these great things we can do, what's the problem? Here's a point I'd like to make. You know, maybe you might take this sort of the level of regulatory scrutiny of this method for granted because it's been like this all your lifetimes. Never before has there been such intense regulatory scrutiny on the basis of purely hypothetical concerns. The coal industry killed people. The oil industry killed people. The pharmaceutical industry killed people. They got regulated, quite rightly. I don't think anyone's had ever even so much as a tummy ache from that you can attribute to this technology. And one of the ironies is that the excessive regulation greatly reduces the costs of bringing things forward, which means that only the multinational corporations have the money to actually take these things forward, which is why we get stuck with, you know, this rather narrow range of utilities, such as herbicide tolerance and BT. Now I want to take a little step back here. So I'm going to recommend a couple of books to those of you who still do that sort of thing. This, to my mind, was a very interesting book. It picks up on, you know, a point made by Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow, which is actually the way the brain works, is it tends to justify people's sort of emotional conclusions rather than helping people deduce an intelligent position from first principles. And what he also articulates very well, I think, is the tribal nature of that. Now, of course, you might say, oh, well, I'm part of the tribe of scientists, you know, and advocates for this technology. I'm a technological fixer and so on. But I'm also classify myself, put it this way, so who would consider themselves part of a tribe of people who are concerned about the environment, concerned about food security, concern about the power of multinational corporations. There you go. Me too. And that's my point. So there's a tribalism which has resulted in a state of affairs whereby opposition to GM crops is kind of a badge of loyalty to those other concerns that we all share. Anyway, it's analysed rather well here, how people get tribal about things. It's actually very timely in the light of Brexit and Trump and so on. So he's a social psychologist, and he analyses how people get tribal about things. And this is another book, I've just finished reading this one actually, Innovation and Its Enemies by Calestis Juma, very interesting Kenyan origin guy who is in the Harvard Business School of Government. And he goes through a number of technologies which met fierce practices that met fierce resistance when they arrived. So the printing presses were going to put the scribes out of work, tractors were going to put horses out of work, refrigeration was going to make the ice industry, sound recording was going to make live musicians out of work, etc. So I think that some of the battles that we see about this technology, you understand better if you read this. So I encourage you to do so. So I talk a bit about regulation, excessive regulation. What is the regulation actually? So now I'm sort of slightly beyond the limit of my sort of hands-on knowledge. I've gotten advice from people like Joyce Tate, Hugh Jones and others on this. So if you actually, let's say we take our blight-resistant potato, possibly with some other beneficial traits like nematode resistance and better storage competence, we want to turn this into a variety that's approved for growth. And I guess this is kind of pre-Brexit. So what do we need to do? Put in the dossier for the European Food Safety Authority. We've got to have a detailed characterization of what happened to the DNA, where it went in. That's okay. You can computer science predict whether the DNA you put in has a predisposition to be allergenic. Yeah, that's okay. You supposedly have to do a 90-day rodent feeding trial, and people have been involved in this. I mean, this is of really dubious significance and is of also questionable from an animal welfare standpoint. And in many cases, you have to do a rodent toxicology study with purified protein. Now, these antenna proteins that I talked about earlier that enable plants to detect a pathogen better prior to turning on defense. There's just no credible mechanism whereby any of these proteins could be damaging. So the idea that you have to do this for that kind of trait is madness. Data from 3 years of field trials for compositional analysis, that makes sense. And then if you're going to be cultivating, this is for whether for import or for cultivation. For cultivation, you need to have an environmental impact assessment on plausible scenarios for what adverse consequences could happen, and also a monitoring plan, which frankly, I've never had to do that, so I can't tell you a lot more about it. So one of the problems of the EU regulations is that the regulation is imposed, all of these regulations are imposed based on the process by which the crop was generated. So if you use recombinant DNA technology to put in herbicide resistance, then it's got to be regulated that way. If you use chemical mutation to come up with a herbicide-tolerant variety, such as for maize or canola, there's absolutely no regulation at all. Still a herbicide-tolerant crop. Of course, some of you may say, well, that needs to be regulated like that. But I would say that needs to be regulated like that. Genome editing, I mean, frankly, the EU it doesn't know what to do. There's a big political battle going on about how to implement regulations on editing. I'll come back to editing later. I don't know if most of you, it's a bit of jargon. So, but here's the real problem. The other real problem in the EU, not just what's required is, from a science standpoint, to my mind, excessive. But after you've gone through EFSA approval, got a positive opinion, then it goes to the Standing Committee of food chain and animal health of member states, and you don't always get consensus there. If there's no qualified majority, you go to the Council of Ministers. If there's no qualified majority, you go to the Commission, and we often sit on their hands for ages because they just can't agree either. They can't get a qualified majority, and then you go down to the bottom. And if you look at how people have voted, so EFSA is a competent authority to administer an excessive regulatory regime, in my view. But, you know, here's the voting characteristics. So Austria votes against every time. Sweden votes in favour nearly every time, except occasionally it abstains, and so on. So there's a distribution here between the different countries and their voting distribution. The UK has actually clearly voted against something. I couldn't tell you what it was, though. But what this tells you is that the judgment on what should be a scientific question is purely political. Now, Joyce Tate in Edinburgh advocates a different way for taking forward new technologies, and she's written quite a lot of this. This is a figure from her. And you need to start off having a much more discourse when new technologies come forward, establishing standards, guidelines before you lock into intense and irrevocable regulation. So there needs to be more flexibility, and you know, again, I'm sort of slightly out of my comfort zone here, so I'll move on just to say that in the US there are moves, and I would have thought that there's you may regard it as a good or a bad, so let's not make a judgment, a high prospect that a Trump administration would see this as a reduction in regulation and therefore a good thing. So APHIS came out with some recommendations last month, and some of the things it says are things like, if a plant that is derived from any method, you know, including the GM method, is demonstrably not likely to be a noxious weed or a plant pest, which is the basis on which things were regulated before, then it could be unregulated. And so this may well mean a reduction in the intensity of regulatory scrutiny in the US if this is approved. It's a recommendation, it's not approved. And the FDA here is seeking comments, and you may wish to comment, on the use of genome editing techniques to produce new plant varieties. But in this document, they recommend a relatively relaxed approach to regulating this technology. So I've said editing a few times. What does it mean? So what it basically means is that these days there are site-specific nucleases, DNA cutting enzymes, which you can direct to specific places in the genome, and these enzymes will do stuff. So a simplest thing they can do is to cut it, and then you get error-prone repair, and then you get a small change locally. And often the kind of changes you get are indistinguishable from changes that might have arisen just by regular mutagenesis in sunlight or with chemical mutagens, neither of which are currently regulated. So even if you wanted to regulate it, it may actually be unpoliceable. Another level of editing, something we're interested in, is, you know, for example, the blight resistance genes we've cloned, we could put them into the corresponding position in tomato or potato. So I think we would argue that this is just a kind of breeding. It requires recombination. In this case, the recombination is triggered by these DNA breaks, and you put, let's say, the blight resistance genes I showed you earlier into the corresponding position in tomato or potato, and there's nothing else going in. The third kind of use of it is that you can just use these methods to put in any new gene, including a BT gene, not a plant gene, at a new location. So, like I say, these are all of these involve the GM method, but in some of them you can cross out the GMness. So I'll just show you something we did here. We made a dwarf tomato by making a mutation in a gene called Prosera. And then the bit that did the editing, the gene that we put in to do the editing, we can cross it out, and then we end up with a plant that is shorter, has a more compact habit. This would be quite useful, but it has no GMness at all, I would argue. In the EU, this is still GM. In the US, it's not. So, in the US, there's clear drift in the sense that in the direction that at least the first kind of editing that I referred to is basically going to be unregulated. In the EU, there is a lot of sitting on hands, discussion, and I see no sign of a decision anytime soon. This is a letter that a scientist I know received from the US Department of Agriculture. So what he did was he edited a bit of a gene which meant that the resulting plant was now less susceptible to Xanthomonas disease. It's a rice plant. So he basically removed some nucleotides at the beginning of a gene, and he received this letter saying, so this is now more resistant to bacterial blight of rice. APHIS does not consider the 5 rice lines as described in this to be regulated under these rules. It's not a noxious weed, etc., etc. So that's what's going to happen in the US. So as you know, there's been talk. This is a headline from last autumn. George Eustice was quoted. So I think there is scope for putting the regulations of GM crops on a more rational basis, not just in the UK, but Europe-wide. And I think that, to my mind, it's not just about the details of the regulation. I commented on the requirements of the dossier earlier. But when we consider an innovation, we have to consider the cost of not doing it as well as the cost of doing it. So for insect resistance, there's a cost of continuing to spray insecticides. These things are poisons. You don't want to do that if you can avoid it. I like to say, this is my last slide pretty much. If we have a precautionary principle, then we need a post-cautionary principle so we can unpick excessive regulation when it's clear there's nothing to regulate. We should regulate the product, not the method used to make it, on the basis of scientifically plausible scenarios for harm. We need to agree standards and specifics. This is partly a matter of international trade, what the standards are for commodities to be traded. But the 90-day rat feeding trial should not always be required. And there's got to be flexibility in the way in which these regulations are implemented. So, over to you.
Very good. Nothing to talk about there. Very good. Thank you, Jonathan, very much.
Sorry, a bit longer than I'd intended.
No, that's great. Okay. Right. Well, I noted down lots and lots. That was actually very good to hear it. I've not heard him do a talk like this for a long time. I noted from certainly my point. Is it on, Tavanda? Yeah. I noted from my point of view a whole range of things that you were throwing out that would be interesting to this sort of thing. Where you ended up on innovation and the economy, I think is a really important theme. Farmer value, I think that's fairly important. Mm-hmm. I think there are, and you always did, and it's good to hear you still doing it, raising philosophical issues. You know, what is nature? What is the natural world, and what is control, and what are we as humans doing? I think you were raising very early on, you raised the question of what's agriculture for? You clearly were raising the issue of politics. You didn't actually get into party politics, but you got into the power of sort of health versus the environment type politics. Safety, clearly a big feature, but is that as important as you thought it was, or other people thought? And then ending up on the issue of Brexit. Just in case you thought we'd all gone to sleep, you suggested that if we get this nice stuff from the United States, we'll have a softer regulatory structure. This was
well, I don't think I intended to make to imply a likelihood of a causative relationship. I was just alerting everyone really to the fact that there are moves to relax regulation in the US, and of course you would imagine that the George Eustices of this world would be taking this as a lead.
Yeah, they are. They're working on it. Okay, enough of me. Who wants to speak? The rule is you say who you are, where you're from, and get to a question if you could.
Hello, I'm Sam. I'm from the Parliamentary Office of Science
Ah,
and Technology.
oh, you
Sorry,
emailed me
I
yesterday, yeah.
texted you
Yeah, yeah.
earlier. I've been speaking to a lot of people about environmentally sustainable agriculture. A criticism that has come of the genetic editing modification process is that it's not really serving farmers and that it's serving the agri-tech sector primarily. How can we make these techniques, which clearly do have some benefits, lots of benefits, how do we make sure it serves the farmer as well as the consumer?
One of the ironies about that question is that what a lot of people criticise the history of GM for is that it's been all about input traits and helping the farmer rather than doing anything for the consumer, and that's why the consumer's been so resistant. I had dinner with a bunch of farmers last night, in fact, in the Mardlers in Norfolk, and the guys I was sitting next to who grow potatoes can't wait for a blight-resistant potato. In a bad year, they spray 22 times a year, and they'd rather not. So there's no doubt that trait would benefit farmers. I mean, insect resistance benefits farmers. I mean, if we could have BT crucifers, for example, we'd lose a lot less to cabbage white butterfly. I mean, nobody even talks about that because it's such a small market. Nobody's going to go through the regulatory process for something so mundane. I mean, there's a couple of genes from sorghum. You could put them into oilseed rape for flea beetle resistance, and that would actually change the neonic discussion, because you have an alternative to neonics to try and control the flea beetle. And I mean, I could give you loads of examples. So these are examples where the farmer would directly benefit from deployment of the technology.
But you gave, Sam, I now need to have that. Have it back. I have to follow the rule. You gave very interesting, I noted down 3 farmer arguments. You said, actually you said speed at the end, which is always the old argument. You said earnings.
Margins, yeah.
And you said, I thought rightly, health and safety.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, this is
Why,
that was
that was the BT
here.
brinjal example, yeah.
That's a really critical issue, because you get into where policy people summits, you know. If people don't know, the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology reviews things and presents overviews for members of Parliament and the Lords. So you're working on a briefing at the moment.
Yeah. And they've just had a rather good briefing on gene editing, if you're interested, it's public.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right to ask the question that, what actually is the advantage to farming of it? But in that, we must not let go of the fact that a lot of farm workers basically put farmers into cabs. They've become hermetically sealed. The health and safety argument I was glad you raised, because that, if you look at pesticide use, it's a major problem in the developing world. There's less of a problem of health and safety here because it's so tightly regulated.
That's exactly right.
But there is a really critical issue. Do you want to come back, Sam? You can come back with the lady behind. I'll sit straight on to her.
I was just sort of taking one view and passing to you, so it's
Yeah.
very interesting to hear your response.
Yeah.
I might send it back the other way, perhaps. I've just got one more question. And this is a bit more about economics. But if we are going to go down this route of research and development into this technique and try and create a market, do you see the relationship, our future relationship with the European Union as absolutely crucial, and how viable it will be if we want to export some of these products into Europe? And what sort of relationship do you think we need with other countries and Europe to get the best out of, certainly as an export market, for some of these goods?
Well, I certainly see the scenario I put forward as fraught, in the sense that, especially if something's approved in the UK but not in the EU, then you can just imagine the litigation if they add mixture into something that gets exported to the EU and people object. So that's less of a risk with Maris Piper potatoes, because these are the white potatoes that the continentals actually aren't very keen on. But if you were engineering wheat, for yellow rust resistance. I think we have the genes that we could greatly elevate yellow rust resistance in wheat, but no companies like to do that because wheat gets into world markets and there'd be inevitable admixture and inevitable ensuing litigation. For the potatoes,
the issue of integrity, really.
well, if different standards in different trading blocks is a problem. It's one of the reasons why it's so expensive to regulate a GM trait. Let's say if you're DuPont or Monsanto, is that it's mostly things like soybeans and wheat that could go anywhere. Sorry, soybeans and maize. And so recently Syngenta, for example, came up with something, I think it was a particular BT maize, and some of it got into an export to China, and China hadn't actually approved that, and they sent it back, and it cost Syngenta a fortune. So that's the sort of thing you've got to avoid. I mean, with respect to our potato, what I was wondering was whether or not, I showed you that snakes and ladders. Just to bend over backwards, we basically submit an EFSA package, we seek EFSA approval, and then we plant it and we grow it. And if some of it gets to the continent and somebody objects, we can say, look, the European Food Safety Authority says this is safe. What's your problem? I'm sorry if your commission's sitting on its hands. But it won't be me taking that commercial risk. So I don't know if those who are will
Maybe we
go all the way down the road.
This is a highly complex area of
Sure
trade
is.
policy, basically. Can you say who you are?
I'm Natalie, I'm here from City University, and it was a bit related to this, and I'm not an expert maybe. But you were saying that the field of GM is currently dominated by multinational companies, and if it wasn't so difficult, and if regulations were more loose, it wouldn't be dominated. So my question is kind of how, in your imagination, would you think it would seeds still be patented? So would GM seeds still be patented? Do you see this as a good solution, and would this contribute, in accessing them, and would this contribute to sustainability?
I didn't discuss intellectual property issues. So executive summary is that so you can patent genes anywhere and license them if you're in the public sector. In the US, you can actually patent varieties and inbreds. In Europe, there's what's called the plant breeders exemption, which is really valuable, I think. What it means is that if one of your competitor breeding companies comes up with a great variety, you can buy it and grow it and cross it to your varieties and try and pull out, over future generations of the plant, some of the traits that make that a good variety. In the US, that's illegal, and that's going to hold back plant breeding, I think, in the long term. So that's really not in the public interest. So if you've got a GM, so in a sense the experiment hasn't been done. So the question is, in Europe, if you had a transgene in it, are you allowed to breed from it? I think actually you could breed from the Monsanto Mon 810 maize as long as you didn't carry forward the Mon 810 transgene from Monsanto. Right, so could
So my question was kind of because a lot of the criticism is around,
Ownership.
that farmers are being
Yeah.
exploited, and
Yeah.
that
okay, that argument.
poverty get worse through patents.
I think I don't buy that argument because farmers buy F1 hybrid maize, even if there's no transgenes in it. They buy F1 hybrid maize rather than planting their own maize every year because they get more yield and make more money if they buy F1 hybrid maize. Farmers in Ethiopia plant F1 hybrid maize, and and that's because it's better quality, it gives them better yields, and they make more money.
I'll accelerate your question as one of our students.
Yeah.
The issue, that was a clever answer as always, but I think it misses the point about the scale of the patenting. That's what certainly for me 30 years ago was the issue was raised. This isn't just plant breeders, a few plant breeders. This is giant corporations taking great slices out of life and owning it. It's on
I
the
don't think
scale.
that's really
So you think it
really
isn't?
true. I think you know, so those kind of patents are not used to sue farmers who save seed. So, for example, if you're a cotton farmer and it's not an F1 hybrid and you self the seed and you plant it, or indeed with wheat that is not GM in the UK, if you plant farm save seed the following year, there's a royalty sharing agreement, because everyone understands the following key principle, which is that genetic improvement in varieties is difficult, expensive and slow and requires substantial investment. And if you don't provide an incentive for people to do that, then that investment won't get made. And if that investment isn't made, then we've all got a food security problem. So we all want the private sector to be, you know, reasonably, and you could argue about what reasonably means, but be reasonably profitable to get a return on its investment. Because otherwise they're going to stop investing and we won't get the yield gains that I would argue we still need.
Over a pint of beer later, I'm going to argue with you
Okay.
about that, because I think
Look forward
this has
to it.
got nothing to do with food security. Actually, the biggest gain to food security is going to be stop eating animals.
Well, now we're back to the wedge concept.
I keep quiet. It's clear.
I think that's one wedge,
Let's come back.
and there's genetics is another wedge.
Yes.
Let's not set up false antitheses.
Okay, let's come back to that.
I want to follow that one as well, but I wanted to come to your big question.
Can you say who you are?
I'm Claire Maris. I work here at the Centre for Food Policy at City. And I've been following and studying the GM controversy for 25 years. You had a question towards the middle of your talk, which was, with all these great things we can do with GM, what's the problem? And I think that's a really interesting question for me anyway. But I think that came after all your nice examples of how we could use GM to make disease-resistant plants, and your really crucial point for me about we shouldn't use just one mode of action. You've got a potato that has just one gene. You don't want to use that. You're going to wait until you've got
Absolutely.
at least three. The problem is we don't have any of those great examples. So you said yourself you're not very proud or full of joy about the ones that we have on the planet. What we have is 95% herbicide-resistant one gene, single gene traits, which are herbicide-resistant or insect-tolerant. So we haven't done the great things that we said 25 years ago were going to be done with GM, and that's still the case today. So I think then it goes to your tribal thing about, well, the problem is we've got these tribes, and I think you were implying, the tribe is on the anti-GM side, but I think, it's on both sides.
Well, I admitted I was an advocate. Yeah.
If we all agree in this room that we're concerned about the environment, we're concerned about maybe the power of multinationals and food security, which I think you were saying, that's you're concerned about, and many people here. So where are the GM crops that do all of that? So so it's not about whether they've got bits of DNA or not. So your joke about the organic farmers should be happy if we just edit those bits of DNA. I think that's trivializing the question. The question is, what's the purpose of it? And how is it contributing to environment, the power of multinationals and food security?
Yeah.
Big
Well,
question.
just back to examples. I mean, I showed you that example from a field in Uganda where you've got a potato, a variety of Victoria, favoured locally with 3 different genes, RPI, VNT1, BLB1, BLB2. And that combination looks totally watertight at the moment. Of course, you never bet against the pathogen. So now we're into an argument about, when you try and control disease, whether with chemistry or with genetics, you're basically participating in an evolutionary game with the pathogen. You're gaming the pathogen. So there's no magic wand about what is the right strategy, but the best information says multiple modes of action. It looks more likely to be durable. Yeah, it's more likely to be durable.
Because I think one of your examples that you were happy about, I think, was the tomato, taking the pepper gene into tomato.
Yeah.
But again, if we use that one single BS2 gene and lots of different vegetables, we're going to have the same problem. So it's that kind of, it's the same paradigm as the chemical paradigm.
So in fact, that BS2 gene will be combined with that EFR gene, which also works against Xanthomonas, and at least one other gene that will be introduced by editing. At least that's the plan for that Two Blades has for the Florida Xanthomonas control. So.
But we haven't got those examples yet.
So I'm glad to hear that you have no aspiration or no support for those who would make it more difficult. to bring these these products forward.
I think the reason it's difficult, partly technological, it's hard work.
Yeah.
I didn't really want
Yeah.
in this field. But also the reasons you said yourself, what company is going to want to invest in those kinds of things?
Yeah.
Even the big ones. They want simple things that are going to have quite quick results.
Well, Simplot it's licensed 2 of our genes and a gene from somewhere else, and although currently they have a single gene, the first disease resistance gene to be deployed commercially will be that VNT1 gene that we cloned, which I'm quite happy about. But I'm less happy about the fact that it's going forward as only one gene. But one of the reasons for that is they have to educate the regulators. So EPA, they've got approval from USDA and FDA, but for EPA approval, EPA only works within the language that it understands. And the language it understands is plant-induced pesticide, PIP. Now, this isn't a pesticide.
This is even more illogical than the European system.
It's not great there. So I totally agree. But Simplot are having to educate the EPA about the difference between a surveillance protein that activates plants' endogenous defences and a protein like BT, which itself is what's killing the target organism. So that takes time. And once they've got over that, they have to get over that hump before they can then come back to them and say, here's a line with 3 different surveillance proteins. That's a tactical decision that they made.
This is all the case for regulatory control. Move on. David Goodman retired from University of California, Santa Cruz. I wanted to follow up the question that was put to
On IP.
what are your views about open access platforms in biotechnology? Because the source of many people's opposition to BT is being captured by soon to be 3 huge multinationals. Yeah. Do you have a view on open access biotechnology? Is it feasible? What would your answer be to that?
In principle, I'm a big fan. There has to be a seed company. I mean, one of the great sources of dismay in my career is where I did my PhD. The Plant Breeding Institute in Cambridge was delivering terrific varieties to British farmers and elsewhere, and it was a public sector breeding enterprise. And Mrs. Thatcher and her zeal privatised it. That was a really bad turn of events, in my view. So there's not much public sector breeding going on. So there's a lot of other seed companies. There's the Enzas, the Reichsfarns, Limagras, and so on. Most of which are not doing much with the GM method, although they're looking with great interest at the editing methods. There's actually quite a lot of IP exchange between these companies. So in the tomato industry, for example, in the US, all of them except Monsanto signed up to an exchange of IP undertaking, which means that if you want to actually access this gene that one company X has brought into its germplasm, then on a royalty yielding basis, it'll be available.
That's between the big firms.
Yeah.
So, okay, define for me open access.
That's a very difficult question. Well, it would be without payment of licensing fees, without payment of royalties, and so on. For example, this may be hearsay, but I understand that the CGIR system of public breeding is really confronting a logjam because of so many patents and royalties that have to be paid. It's just like a jungle on disentangling private governance. You're complaining about public governance, but there's also an issue about private governance.
I think the CGI system is very good at breeding varieties, and let's say consider wheat, for example. I guess they generate varieties and they give them away. But that has to be paid for, and they're having a real funding shortfall. I think they've got more of a funding problem than an IP logjam problem. So, I'm in the public sector. I came from the public sector, and it's a source of dismay to me, for both short-term and long-term reasons, that there isn't more public sector breeding and variety development, especially as if you have public sector plant breeding, you actually train the next generation of plant breeders. What's another problem in plant breeding that's often spoken about is a sort of demographic cliff that is pending. A lot of plant breeders are 50 plus. I mean, Monsanto. We had a go visit from Rob Fraley of Monsanto. Training, yes, training should.
Those wedges are going to disappear.
Yeah, well, they won't disappear, but they'll compositionally change. But I mean, Fraley gave a talk at Norwich 10 years ago or so, and he said, we're going to hire 600 plant breeders this year. I mean, that's spectacular, and it's a real problem finding all those people with the requisite skills. I'm not sure I'm really addressing your question.
But I think it's a brilliant question from you.
Yeah, it wasn't a brilliant answer.
No, but because this is, with the greatest respect, is beyond you. This is the politics of who owns. It's, you rightly started. This is about the ownership of genes. And what would public breeding? I mean, I met him when he was a public breeder. And that's almost impossible to beat. Is that what we would want post to actually recommend? A rebirth.
We can't recommend.
Well, I know you can't. We can. Anyway, over to you. I haven't got the microphone. I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah. I'm Kenneth Nyama from the UK Food and Drug Federation. You mentioned that there is excessive regulation in GM technology, which is partly correct. And I think you are correct to say that positive opinions, which in many cases is submitted by multinational companies who are able to meet the sort of like expensive process of putting together dossiers. But you also mentioned that the approval process itself is a problem, which is correct. So do you see any changes or any moves in terms of like consumer acceptance for GM, if there is any change in the approval process within the Union? For example, the changes in the comitology procedures, which has been proposed.
Okay, that's the sort of thing we work on.
Yes, I think
comitology and the policy.
You may be beyond my expertise there, but so one part of your question, I think, was so in the event that there were to be changes in the approval process, would you risk losing public enthusiasm or acceptance?
No, I'm asking whether there will be any change for the public to accept GM if member states start approving the GM crops.
Yeah, well, of course, we're all second guessing, and if I was better at reading the public mood, I might have predicted Brexit, which I didn't. Oh well, so I should ask you. But I think my impression is that on the subject of public approval, of the method and its various implementations, most people are not bothered. They are in the "I am not bothered" camp. There's a few people who are strenuously anxious about it, but I don't. If you look, there's a slide I got somewhere on where's here? It's food-specific issues. Survey of UK consumers. So GM foods down here, and here's a bunch of other things which you can't read. Maybe you can if I go to full screen. So I don't think most people are bothered, but of course that I could be deluding myself, because if there was any sort of in their diets and labelled and so on, maybe they'd be more bothered. But they're more worried about the amount of fat, sugar, salt in food, food poisoning, use of additives, foods aimed at children, use of pesticides to grow food, etc. So GMness is down here.
That was 10 years ago.
This, I don't think people have become.
What about the second part of your question?
Yeah, the second
About the
I can dig it out.
Yeah, my second part is that part of the problem is that member states are opposed to approving GM crops or GM events.
Sure.
The Commission is proposed to change the way the voting system is done. Do you see that it's going to change anything in terms of like member states voting?
I mean, the only change I'm familiar with is this one whereby if EFSA approves it, The
Give a
local
slide on what
member
process
states
that-
can elect to, and it's approved sort of at the Commission.
Yeah.
Then member states can elect to say we're not going to plant it even though it's approved.
Yeah.
So that in that sense, decision making is, there's more subsidiarity or whatever the term is. But I'm not aware of
Yeah,
another
that's
change.
for cultivation.
Yeah.
For authorized GM events, is probably the system is slightly different at the moment.
Yes.
Because member states do not give any qualified majority in terms of voting.
Yeah.
The Commission, it's legal up to them to approve any GM crop that, as I said, is safe.
Uh-huh.
And the Commission doesn't want to do that, and they've changed the voting system for the process.
Well, that might be,
To give the responsibility to member states.
yeah,
Yeah.
that might constitute progress, I would say. But you can see all kinds of problems. I think Merkel was anxious about that kind of scenario because, the whole point of the common market is that single market is that goods can be, exchanged freely between states. And if one state says such and such a thing is not allowed and another state says it is, then there's scope for all kinds of disagreements.
So can I just say that?
Yeah, very quickly.
The other thing is the link between GM and new breeding techniques.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have seen that probably because GM has got like a negative stigma attached to it.
Yeah.
Now we are looking at new breeding techniques,
Yes.
which again there's like at the moment no legal process to regulate them. Do you see the same process being followed in terms of like resistance on the acceptance of new breeding techniques?
Well, there's two issues. So one is what will be the outcome of the deliberations in the EU about regulating it, and the second is what will the public think about these methods and whether they are more or less anxiety-provoking than the GM method. And I think it's. We all have a responsibility to not get people worried over nothing, and whether or not it'll play out that way is unpredictable. But obviously it will be possible for NGOs to inflame anxieties. They've done it in the past, in my view, unhelpfully. So I hope they don't do it again. But we'll have to we'll have to wait and see. I certainly can't predict. I'll come back to what I said before. I didn't predict Brexit, so I'm not very good at predicting the public mood.
I'm Luke, I study here at City. It's kind of a policy question, really, but post-Brexit, what are the implications of the devolved nations in loosening regulation in the UK? Because from what I understand, Wales has always historically been opposed because of their organic sector to GM within the population and within government. And what I understand again, I don't think you can't grow a crop without the other two devolved nations' approval. From what I understand, I don't know if that's true. You might be able to clarify that for me. How do you see that playing out post-Brexit?
Well, we are beyond my certain knowledge here.
Yeah.
Obviously it's a complication, and back to this is one for George Eustace, isn't it? To figure out. Hello, Peter.
Peter Maltford, I'm a farmer from Norfolk, not one who went in with you.
Yes.
I'm an organic farmer and I work for the Soil Association, organisation. And I want to come to George Eustace and say, maybe just the answer to your question is that with Scotland and Wales have both made clear that they won't allow GM crops to be grown, and these are devolved issues. Northern Ireland depends a bit with the agriculture ministries, and they're generally being opposed. And on public opinion, Jonathan, you said people tend to highlight things which they feel are a threat, or which are in the news, which sugar and salt certainly have been lately, and GM hasn't. Where there's tracking surveys looking at attitudes to GM, actually, to my surprise, attitudes have hardened against GM. the FSA, Food Standards Agency, did a survey and they found higher.
Yeah, yours was 10
Opposition
years ago.
to-
Yeah.
Modern ones show a hardened.
But
Okay.
not that recent. The response to George Eustace's remark was really interesting and encouraging for people like me who oppose GM, because the National Farmers Union said words to the effect, and I'm not quoting, it's all very well for the politician to make remarks in favour of GM, but I'm a farmer, and on my farm I have to plant crops I'm going to be able to sell. And I think post-Brexit, particularly if we lose Pillar 1, the basic farm support which is paid by area, farmers will become more market aware and conscious, and that is not going to be helpful to GM. You quoted quite a lot from America about the political changes, and you're right, Trump may well try and deregulate, and there have been moves to deregulate in the UK for some time. But organics growing in double figures in America. There's a shortage of non-GM seeds for farmers to plant because the single trait seeds, which have been mentioned, have become so problematic. The BT and the Roundup Ready seeds. The amount of GM soya and maize being imported into the EU for animal feed is dropping year on year, and non-GM is taking its place. Organic is growing about 6-7% in the UK compared to about 0.5% for the general food market. So if you look at the market drivers, they're really moving strongly against GM all over the world, not just in Western Europe or in the UK. If we go on to talk about public benefits, I'll probably say no.
Question too.
So the question is, do you think gene editing and the fancy new techniques which you and others have been excited about will change the way that markets are moving globally against GM?
Yes, I don't know. I think that I'd like to answer with a question. So why won't you plant a blight-resistant potato that has been generated using the GM method, if it's favoured by the market for all the other traits? The varieties that are advocated by organic farmers, Sarpo Meyer or whatever, they're not even in the top 50 of varieties that get planted by acreage in the UK. And that's because their properties are not, don't have a sufficient, mean they don't have a sufficient market.
The reason is because organic farmers have, as a philosophical approach, a desire not to use external inputs. So we don't want to use sprays, and the blight-resistant potatoes may be resistant to blight, but they will still need fertilizer, manufactured fertilizer, and probably some insecticides and other inputs as well.
Not any more than any other potato.
No, that's not true. There are varieties which are better suited to low input systems.
Mm-hmm.
I grow old-fashioned varieties, old-fashioned from a non-organic farmer's point of view, varieties of barley and wheat, because they are better adapted to low input, lower nitrogen, lower pollution, lower greenhouse gas emission systems than my neighbours who are putting on manufactured nitrogen on newer, more recently bred varieties. And because we listen to our customers, and our customers prefer a farming system which doesn't use GM and doesn't use those external inputs. So it's two drivers.
Is plant breeding an intervention?
No, he's asking me a question.
Yeah.
Right,
Well, I'd like to ask him one more question, which is plant breeding an intervention? Is plant breeding okay? Or
yes, I think plant breeding is. And I agree with you about mutation should be subject to similar controls. We've long felt that.
Can I just ask you that question?
You can very, and then I'm working my way over to the lady over there who's waiting very
You mentioned that the demand for soya being imported for animal feed is dropping here and there. I'm grateful for that source of information because for my understanding, we are not so sufficient in terms of like solar bean. So in the EU, in total, they import between 70 and 90% of soya bean from third countries, most of which is GM. So I want to find out from you the source of like information that is not demand for that.
Yeah, I'd like to know where you get some of those figures, because they were not consistent with what I'm hearing. But
Well, can I say quickly? You let him ask me a question, it's not my thing. I've always got to keep quiet. The balance between GM soya and non-GM soya is changing. There's more non-GM soya coming in because German supermarkets are moving to non-GM animal feed. And the French supermarket Carrefour, which is the second largest in the world, has got a policy of moving to non-GM animal feed. And Waitrose in this country has now started to do the same for poultry and other products. And they're getting the soya, either non-GM soya from Latin America, or a new project which is growing non-GM soya in the Danube region in Southeast Europe. And if you look up the Danube project on the internet, you'll see some details of their growing. And there's a thing called Biotech in Germany, which keeps the data on the amount of GM and non-GM soya coming into the EU. Well known.
can I give an answer to one of your comments? I mean, surely, given that most potatoes are not grown using the organic potato production method, it's better if you are growing to, and I predict they won't be, then it's better if those potatoes are grown without spraying 20 times a year than with spraying 20 times a year. So, you know, please get out of the way.
I'm Roberta.
Hi.
I'm Roberta from the University of Sheffield, and I'm doing a PhD on GM in the media and social media.
Oh, fascinating.
And I'm with the Grantham Centre for Sustainable Futures. So sustainability is a big part of my PhD as well. And I have two questions, because in the meantime I've accumulated two, so it does work. So do you think that, because you showed that graph with the consumers' acceptance of GMOs, do you think that we're asking the right questions? Like, should I be concerned about GMOs? Are you concerned about, how much are you concerned about GMOs? Should I be concerned in the first place? Like, if I was a consumer doing that survey, I was like, I would have been like, you know, why should I be concerned? Is it a concern? Or
It's a leading question.
And my second question is about gene editing, because analyzing what's happening in the media at the moment, there's a lot going on about gene editing applied also for medical purposes and cancer cures, babies.
And GM,
Yeah, there's a lot going on about cures for leukemia or for curing genetic diseases. Do you think that the debate might shift a little, and consumer might be more accepting of GMOs if we opened the debate also? Because medical applications of GM technology have proven to be more accepted in the public debate.
Yeah.
Do you think there might be the gene editing might actually be opening a door into the consumer's heart, to say it in a
I mean, sociologically, we may look back in 10 years' time and say that's what happened. You know, I don't want to adopt the position of, well, we can't get the job done with GM because everybody's neurotic about it, so let's see if we can do it with gene editing. You know, I don't want to be in that position. Back to your question about what the right question is. So how about this for the right question? You know, given that improving the performance of crops is a good thing, which of the following methods do you approve or disapprove of? You know, breeding, editing, GM, strongly disapprove, couldn't care less, approve, strongly approve. Then you might get something that was more meaningful, I think.
Sorry, can I add something?
You can. PhD students can ask anything.
You earlier said that the method is not the point.
Yeah.
And I think what might be,
I know.
because I'm not a politician, or I don't know much about policy making, but I think that a shift in policy making might be talking to consumer about the applications of GM and gene editing rather than focusing on the methodology, because it seems confusing, like just trying to explain the science behind GM has been shown to be not necessarily the only thing, the issue.
Sure. No, I think that the better point to start in all of these things, and I maybe I didn't do that enough in my presentation, but is to say, look, guys, we got a problem here. We want to maximize yield so we don't waste land producing food and use any more land than we have to produce what's required, minimize our impact on the planet thusly. So here's some methods we can use to solve these particular problems, which are really severe problems: potato late blight, insects eating our eggplant or whatever. And the point is not, I mean, if we could do it another way, that'd be fine by me. I'm not on a religious evangelistic crusade here for any particular method, but I am on a crusade. If I'm on a crusade or anything, it is for a rational appraisal in terms of costs and benefits, upside and downside. To my mind, whether you achieve disease resistance incorporating the editing method or with straight GM, they both work. They're both unproblematic. They're both no big deal. Let's just focus on solving the problem. But I think one representation or posture may receive more public acceptance than another. So, go with what works.
Okay, we've got 2 more questions. We're stopping.
I'm Amanda, a food policy student here at City. So, touching really on the sharing of information, I wondered who else was doing work like yours. You're working for Sainsbury Lab, and I know there's Ralstonia, who obviously a big research centre, and that they're involved with GM. I wonder what sort of collaboration there was and whether that's formalised.
It's very ad hoc. Science is done by scientists who get excited about something, either an approach or an idea or a concept for what's going on in biology that they can get at. So people who are doing GM. I think I'm the only one really working on potato late blight resistance genes, cloning. There are a couple of other labs, including my colleague Sophie and Camoon in Norwich, and also Paul Birch's lab at James Hutton in Dundee. Ingo Hein up there too, who work on late blight. Other people work on other diseases or other problems. We all talk to each other when it comes to the technicalities of trying to conduct trials. One of the tragedies of the last 30 years, much bewailed by our mutual friend Charlie Clutterbuck, is the decline in public sector science in the area. We've gone down from like 30 research institutes to 5 over the last 30 years, something like that.
This is the tragedy.
So in fact, there's a lot less public sector expertise for the public to turn to for knowledge. ADAS has been privatised. ADAS is now selling stuff for companies or advising them on what product to adopt.
How many people here know what ADAS is? See, this, but it's an age, but well, young people. It's nice to know. It was the Agricultural Development Advisory Service. It was a public service run from the state, funded by the state to help farmers do the right thing. It doesn't. I mean, we've got a fissured world.
Another thing, privatised by Mrs. Thatcher and her zeal.
Yeah.
So in the US, there are other people doing this sort of thing, and also in Holland, there's a big research program cloning blight resistance genes in Holland, and also trying to bring some blight resistant potatoes of locally favoured varieties using the method.
So would a policy of open communication work, or would it be too vulnerable to being taken by somebody else?
Open communication, not just open sourcing.
What do you mean by open communication? We communicate with each other openly. I mean, not in a way that everybody can read our emails, but we communicate with each other a lot.
But I suppose
except when we're competing.
Could be people working in a small way, or there could be things you're doing. It's just as science, you don't know what's going to help another development necessarily unless you know what's happening. So if it was more public access.
I mean, people who are active in the science circulate at meetings and read the literature and pretty much know who's doing what. It's rare that you get blindsided, except that sporadically you get blindsided by a bunch of papers from some lab in China that you've never heard of who are doing really good work.
Okay, the last question is
Lawrence.
to someone who used to fund you.
Lawrence Cockcroft, I'm just an independent person. Just looking back to the big picture, It
Yeah.
seems extremely likely that at the front of the queue, to use the current phrase, for trading agreements will be an agreement between a post-Brexit UK and the US. I think it's also an extremely safe bet that the huge corporate pressures emanating from US agribusiness will insist that open access to GM technology is part of that agreement. Otherwise, there won't be an agreement. And the present politics suggest that that will go through. So can you comment on the significance of that for what we've been talking about?
I think for the most part that will comprise import of US produced food products because the varieties, the germplasm they generate, you know, it'll be unlikely to be about insisting that we plant their varieties. You know, their maize lines won't thrive here. We don't grow soybeans here. It's the wrong climate. And even the potato varieties they grow there are different. There's a few possible exceptions to that. I could imagine Simplot saying, wouldn't it be great if the blight-resistant russet ranger that we have could be planted in the UK? Please make it so. Yeah, so I think there'll be arguments that we will be required in any such trade deal to accept more food products than are currently approved under EU regulation, but I doubt if it'll affect the varieties we plant.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question to end on. Look, we've overrun, but we started just 3 minutes late, so this is appropriate. So I want you to join me and thank Jonathan very much for a very genial.
Thank you. Thank you for all your questions.
No, thank you. And I think it shows how actually this isn't just an issue of the past. This is going to be enormously hot with Brexit again.
It
in
is.
a big way. But bigger than the first round. So thank you.